This episode is brought to you by Progressive. Progressive helps you compare direct auto rates from a variety of companies so you can find a great one, even if it's not with them. Quote today at progressive.com to find a rate that works with your budget. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Comparison rates not available in all states or situations. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, September 8th, 1971, a consumer activist by the name of Esther Peterson reached out to the Giant supermarket chain and kicked off the first ever nutrition label initiative. Peterson persuaded the supermarket to put information on labels that it's pretty common now. You'll recognize this. For instance, disclose what seafood had been previously frozen or compare calories and proteins and add sell-by dates to perishable products. But a lot of this was not done at the time. Eventually, these labels would be everywhere, would come to be regulated and required, but also, as I think we all know, continue to be very confusing and maybe even intentionally misleading at times. So this is our chance to talk about the roots of the nutrition label and how it fits into larger questions of food and health policy. Here, as always, Nicole Hammer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
And our special guest for this episode is Xaq Frolich, Associate Professor of History of Technology at Auburn University and author of the forthcoming book, From Label to Table, Regulating Food in America in the Information Age. Xaq, thank you for joining us. Congratulations on the forthcoming book. It's all done, right?
Yes, it's done.
It's just ready to go. Good.
Yes, no. Thank you for having me here. And yes, it's all done.
It's been boxed and labeled. The sell by date is on it. You know.
Not yet expired, I hope.
Yeah.
So I think I undersold Esther Peterson a bit in my intro. I called her a consumer activist. She was more than that, right? This person who convinced Giant to start labeling stuff. So tell us a little bit about her and her work.
Yeah, no, she was an amazing figure. So she was from Utah, but eventually would move to New England. She was a teacher and she got active in teacher unions. And out of that work, eventually she became the first woman lobbyist for AFL-CIO, which is this big federation of unions in America. She would spend 10 years in Sweden because her husband was a diplomat, where she continued to do labor organization. And then when she came back to the United States, she was active with the Kennedy election campaign, and this is how she got appointed the head of the Women's Bureau in the Department of Labor under President Kennedy, and then later was special assistant for consumer affairs under President Johnson. And so she became very active and visible in politics, promoting consumer rights. She was important for pushing through the Equal Pay Act of 1963. And then at the end of the Johnson administration, she comes back in the private sector, and Giant Foods invites her to come work there as vice president of consumer affairs. And that's sort of where the story with the nutrition label begins.
And so Giant, do people know Giant? I went to high school in the DC area, so I know Giant, but big food supermarket chain kind of in the Mid-Atlantic region, right?
Yeah, and known for being progressive. It's a regional supermarket chain. It's based in Maryland, but it is near D.C., and so that's part of its importance in the story of nutrition labeling in the government.
But in terms of bringing Esther Peterson in, I mean, I'm interested in that. Is this like a classic, like revolving door kind of like post-political career? I'm going to go work for a company. Did they bring her in because they thought she would like make things easier in terms of lobbying, and then all of a sudden she's like muckraking from the inside? I mean, what's going on there?
No, this is the really interesting thing about her at Giant. She was a very well-known and well-respected consumer advocate. And this was a period, so the 1960s, you have Nader's Raiders, you have the civil rights movement starting to get involved in like what was called the hunger lobby, where they're concerned about poverty and hunger. So you've got lots of people looking at rising food costs and concerns about this. And she's in the thick of it with them. And then you have this shift in the 1970s. And one of the things that I'm interested in is how people start to get really disillusioned with government. And so in the 1970s, you start having all of these people looking at private solutions. And in a way, what Esther Peterson argues when she's at Giant is that the progressive retailers like Giant Food could be an ally of the consumer. So there's kind of interesting shift where it's about how can we do consumer rights from within retailing.
And how can you use the private sector to do the kind of regulation that the government either can't do or is unwilling to do, or people don't trust the government to do? And certainly like the FDA plays a big role in this, so I don't want to say the government isn't involved at all, but that kind of attempt to work with these private industries, or the private industries working to forestall regulation by trying to do it on their own, seems to be a big through line in 20th century America.
Exactly. And there's a kind of cultural dimension of this. The 1970s is sort of famously the me decade, which would be important with a lot of the interest in labeling, because this idea that you're letting consumers, you're giving them the information, you're equipping them to make their own decisions. But again, it also has to do with people who are unhappy with the Food and Drug Administration. They're unhappy with how they're regulating food labels. And so private companies fill in that void. And Esther Peterson sees this as an opportunity with Giant Food to do so.
Yeah. Part of I think the frustration with labels is that they can be so confusing, right? Like if you have a sell by date versus the expiration date versus like, when is this really bad? Can I eat this? Like, or when you look at certain, things in terms of like the percentage of sugar versus like the percentage of your daily intake. Like there's a lot of things I look on labels now and I'm like, is this good or bad?
What you need is Esther Peterson to pop out of the show, pop down the aisle and be like, buy that, don't buy that.
Yeah.
And you talked about the date labeling. That was another example of a kind of reform happening that Giant Food was at the head of, but other supermarkets were also interested in. You had before what was called closed date labeling, where retailers needed to know when food was expiring or when it would go off. So they had this sort of closed code system. And consumers were figuring this out. There was a group of housewives who organized and sort of hacked the code that the supermarkets were using, and then they published a book so that people could know when that food was going off.
Wow.
And eventually this became a kind of pressure on supermarkets to explore what was called open date labeling. But you have this problem that you're recognizing where, is this for the supermarket to say when they're removing it from the shelf? Is this for us to know when we need to throw it away? There's a lot of confusion that comes out of that.
It's so interesting to think about consumer organization and consumer response. It's very different, but it does make me think about like women's health organizations in the late 60s and 70s who were looking around and they were saying, our doctors don't know anything about our bodies, so we need to compile that information so women have access to this information so they can make informed choices. And that idea of consumers making informed choices drives so much of this. And part of it is about empowering consumers. And part of it is, again, about like, rather than the FDA saying, well, you can't sell something with like 50 grams of sugar as a breakfast cereal. It's like, well, we'll give you the information and you can decide whether you want to have, 6 tablespoons of sugar every morning to start your day.
Obscure fact of Food and Drug Administration history, around the same time as these innovations are happening in nutrition labeling, the FDA authorizes, it's the second patient package information insert, but it's for the birth control pill. And it's very much because, so before this, the idea is the doctor is the one who needs to know, and they tell the patient what they need to know, and there's no need to have, package information for patients because it'll just be confusing. But you do have women's rights groups really unhappy with the kind of paternalistic relationship doctors have with them. They're unhappy with the risks, apparently, that the FDA authorized with the birth control pill. And so they're lobbying the FDA saying, hey, get us this information. Let us take risk decisions in our own hand. And I argue in my book, actually, there's a kind of parallel argument happening with diet advice. Stop hiding the health information from us, because in the older system, the FDA said standard food shouldn't have that. And give us the nutrition information. So you have consumer advocates saying, they call them silent labels. They're like, the labels won't tell us what ingredients they have. They won't tell us what health information they have. How can we adapt the diets to our own special lifestyle?
Right. So I am curious how much kind of health and health policy plays into this versus consumer rights and consumer advocacy. I mean, were people in these early days talking about this as a health issue?
Yeah, so it was a consumer rights issue. In fact, one of the interesting things in the flyer, the Giant Food flyer explaining this new labeling system they have at the very top of one of their flyers, you have the right to be informed. And this is directly from President Kennedy's 1962 Consumer Bill of Rights. So they're definitely drawing on this idea that we're empowering consumers with information and they have the right to this information. But you also have among food producers and consumers of diet products, a lot of frustration with the food standard system that the FDA has, where it is really difficult to market artificially sweetened foods, to market low fat and especially low saturated fat foods. And this is a new kind of health trend that's happening. And so there is actually among physicians organizations and doctors, they're saying, hey, actually preventative health is important for future risk of disease. And so even healthy people should be taking an interest in this new health information. That's very different when the food standards system was set up in the 1930s and 40s, where the FDA's attitude is the ordinary consumer shouldn't be tricked and fooled by this health stuff. They should be eating food for food. And so there is a kind of change there that's happening.
You're used to hearing my voice on the world, bringing you interviews from around the globe.
And you hear me reporting environment and climate news. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're now with you hosting The World Together. More global journalism with a fresh new sound.
Listen to The World on your local public radio station and wherever you find your podcasts.
I have a question about how this all fits into kind of the arc of Peterson's activism, because I think sometimes we tend to put labor activism and consumer activism as somehow at odds with one another, right? We either focus on workers or we focus on consumers. And she's somebody who focused on both, right? She comes out of labor organizing and she moves into consumer activism. How did she think about the connection between those two forms of activism?
That's a good question. Yeah, I'm actually not sure about that. I have to say, I think in the late 60s, you have this moment in the 60s where there's this realization, Kennedy says we are all consumers. And so there's this idea that through the consumer society, we can achieve this democracy where everyone has what they want. And then there's a recognition over the course of the 60s that this isn't happening. So you have it in the civil rights movement. Much of America is shocked to discover that there's hunger. Not everyone who's working on this is so surprised, but the rest of America that discovers this suddenly is learning that the affluent society of food that we thought we lived in is actually failing for a certain segment of society. And I think a lot of the labor organizers, we're seeing housewife associations picketing supermarkets because of rising costs of food. If you're earning money and then that money is disappearing because the prices of goods are going up, I think they started saying, hey, these kinds of consumer issues are actually important rights that we have to think about and get the government involved in.
Mm-hmm. You wrote a whole book about this, and people should go read it. But I'm just curious, kind of in the larger sweep of this story of labeling. I mean, Kellie hinted at it, but, when you look at a label, I feel like a lot of us just have this sense of like someone's trying to pull one over on me, right? Someone's trying to hide something. Someone's trying to elide. Someone's trying to just like get away with something. And I'm curious if you think that that's a justified sense. And also, was there ever a moment kind of in this history when it did feel like, oh, these were actually educating people and empowering people and potentially moving us towards healthier choices and so forth?
That's a great question. I admit I have a book's worth of an answer to it, so I'm going to try to pick and choose how I answer that. But I will say, first of all, that there are definitely moments where people are trying to use labels to confuse consumers. One of the things I talk about in the conclusion, I have this section called Logic of Labeling, where I'm really critical about how when we use food labels to solve political questions, there are lots of problems. And one of those problems is that sometimes you can put information on a label that really misleads the consumers. I see this in the genetically modified food debates, where there's a lot of effort to try to not get people to understand what a bioengineered food is, or to make it hard to find out that information. You can see it a bit with ingredients as well, in terms of what's called and/or labeling, where they are trying to accommodate industry's tendency to swap out ingredients, but also means that you don't know exactly what you're getting. But there are also moments where people are genuinely trying to improve the information. So when I interviewed the people at the Food and Drug Administration who were there in the 1990s, when the nutrition facts label was getting created, they really felt like we were going to create a trustworthy, they called it a government brand. Like this was going to be a reliable source of information for nutrition information. Now, even there, the problem that happens is it's not easy to use it well. And initially there's a lot of public investment in public education and explanations of how to use it, and that disappears. And who fills the void? Companies. And so companies become the only investment in educating consumers. And of course, they do that with a very particular agenda.
One of the big changes I love that they made in labeling in recent years has to do with this suspicion of deception. And that is labeling both the serving size information and the entire package information, especially on things where people are likely to eat the entire muffin instead of just a third of it, or the entire pint of ice cream. So there do seem to be some changes that get put into effect that really are aimed at mitigating or answering people's suspicions.
But then they face some real challenges too. So like the 2,000 calorie figure. We all take this so seriously. And actually, when I was interviewing them about it, I realized it's actually not meant to be very precise. So that like the average calorie intake for all of America at the time was seen to be something more like 2,150. So it was even higher. And people were upset because women needed less. And they also felt like men were getting too much anyway. And so people were saying we need to have a lower one. And eventually they went with the 2,000 number, not because it was accurate for anyone in particular, but because it looked like a round number. So it was easy to do math. And they assumed that if it was a round number, people would recognize it was not meant to be an exact figure. Today, you'll have a lot of people who think like, we need 2,000 calories a day. And people say this. But actually, that was never really the case. It was much more pragmatic and sort of bureaucratic about why they choose that number.
I'm curious, and I don't know if you'll be able to answer this or not, but when I think about the time when I lived in New York, and I believe it was Bloomberg that put all of the calories on like fast food items and things like that. So you could go into your favorite taco spot and you see the burrito is 1,500 calories or something, something that seems heinous. And you're like, do I eat this? Do I not eat this? Does having that information actually have an impact on what people choose to consume? Or is it whatever, I'm eating this burger? Or I guess how much do nutritional labels or calories have an impact on people's choice?
Yeah, great question. I would say, for some people it has a big impact. A lot of people do not even think about this stuff. For foods, for the restaurant labeling, I think, it has an impact, but then people, start to ignore it. They get in their habits and they move on. For the food labeling, even if you don't care about the nutrition label, once it's put on there, food industry starts changing the recipe. So one of the things I say is like, in 1994, when the nutrition facts label goes on it, or in 1973, when you have this sort of nutrition labeling coming out, industry's changing the foods. So even if you're not reading it, your diet is changing. So that's kind of one answer. The other thing I have to say about all of this interest in giving us this nutrition information is that we eat food for a lot of reasons, and health is just one of them. And so, there's a way in which this encourages us to think that health is sort of the important way of thinking about food, when in fact there are other reasons why we eat food. And I find that will also be something, that can be problematic about all the emphasis on nutrition labeling.
That's really fascinating. All right. Before we let you go, when you go shopping, is there a labeling practice that drives you particularly batty, or is there something, if you were in charge of this, you would kind of implement right away?
Oh gosh, good question. I will admit, before this project, I never read food labels. That's sort of a shocking realization. I really came to this kind of like, wow, this thing is here, and why is this here? And then I started reading up into the history and investigating the history of the nutrition facts label. In fact, I had friends visit from other countries. And at the time, this wasn't in those countries. And they saw this and they were just like, this is so American. And they thought it was American because it was like scientific. Like, why would you be looking at nutrition information if you're French or you're Spanish? You know what you're supposed to eat. Like, you eat French and Spanish food, and like that's what you've always eaten. And why are you like turning to these scientists to find out what's healthy and these weird modified functional foods and all that? They were convinced it was because it looked like a legal disclosure, and they know that we have all these warning labels everywhere, and they're just like, oh, that litigious American culture. And there's something to that too. It is kind of a legalistic solution, right? I actually do believe in the importance of labels and the importance of using information. But one of the reasons why in my book, I come across really skeptical about it as a policy solution is that I don't think it really answers what we're all really anxious about with our food. So I think when you're talking about trust, and you're talking about sort of trusting where your food comes from, you're not looking for proof. So the label is about saying, prove that it has this and that, and it has this, and therefore it's safe and whatnot. But actually, I think trust is built around relationships. And what really is the problem in the American food supply that this book describes is a moment where we're no longer having a relationship with the people who make our food, and that makes us deeply anxious. And that doesn't change. At the end of the story, we have more and more information about our food, and we're still wondering, is this safe? Is it good for me?
Yeah.
Can I trust where it comes from?
Yeah.
All right.
That's a good point.
Good final point to end it on. But we will say there's obviously lots more in the book, From Label to Table, Regulating Food in America in the Information Age. It's coming out this
November.
fall, right? November,
Yes.
but it is available for pre-order now, right? And I know
That's correct.
Important. So folks can go find that. We'll put a link in the show notes, and obviously send it out on social and so forth. Xaq Frolich of Auburn, thank you so much for doing this, and congratulations on the forthcoming book.
Thank you.
Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thanks, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Do you really think that the American homemaker demands such fabulous containers?
They certainly do not. Why do they make so many? Why do they put toothpaste in 32 different sizes under, a couple of ounces? Why do they put shampoo in so many different sizes so that you really can't figure out what the unit price is? I think all of these are to fool people.
Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. What is Odoo? Well, Odoo is an all-in-one management software with apps for every business need. Odoo has apps for CRM, accounting, sales, HR, inventory, manufacturing, and everything in between. And they're all in one easy-to-use software. And the best part about Odoo? All Odoo apps are integrated, helping you get things done faster and more efficiently. So, when you think about business, think Odoo. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's ODOO.com/thisday.
Radiotopia.